Do you think that 3 days after Bontshe was dead, anyone knew where he lay? There was not even a gravestone for a future antiquarian to unearth, and now the name of Bontshe Schweig one last time. A shadow, no mind, no heart preserved his image. Nothing remained of him at all, not a trace. Alone he lived, and alone he died. Were not humanity so noisy, someone might have heard Bontshe's bones as they cracked beneath their burden. Were the world in less of a hurry, someone might have noticed that Bontshe, a fellow member of the human race, had in his lifetime 2 lifeless eyes, a pair of sinkholes for cheeks, and even when no weight bent his back, a head bowed to the ground as if searching for his own grave. Were men as rare as horses, someone would surely have wondered where he disappeared to. When Bontshe was brought to the hospital, the corner of the cellar he had called his home did not remain vacant, because 10 men bid for it at once. When he was taken from the hospital ward to the morgue, 20 sick paupers were candidates for his bed. When he was carried out of the morgue, 40 men killed in the fall of a building were carried in. Think of how many others are waiting to share his plot of earth with him. And well may you wonder how long he will rest there in peace. He was born in silence. He lived in silence. He died in silence. And he was buried in a silence greater yet. But that's not how it was in the other world. There, Bontshe's death was an occasion. A blast of the Messiah's horn sounded in all 7 heavens. Bontshe Schweig has passed away. Bontshe has been summoned to his maker. The most exalted angels with the brightest wings informed each other in mid-flight. A joyous din broke out in paradise. Bontshe Schweig. It doesn't happen every day. Young silver-booted cherubs with diamond-bright eyes and gold filigreed wings ran gaily to greet Bontshe when he came. The flapping of their wings, the patter of their boots, and the merry ripple of laughter from their fresh, rosy mouths echoed through the heavens as far as the mercy seat, where God himself soon knew that Bontshe Schweig was on his way. At the gates of heaven stood Father Abraham, his right hand outstretched in cordial welcome, and the most radiant of smiles on his old face. But what was that sound? It was 2 angels wheeling a golden chair into paradise for Bontshe to sit on. And what was that flash? It was a gold crown set with gleaming jewels, all for Bontshe. What? Before the heavenly tribunal has even handed down its verdict? Marveled the saints, not without envy. Ah, answered the angels, everyone knows that's only a formality. The prosecution doesn't have a leg to stand on. The whole business will be over in 5 minutes. You're not dealing with just anyone, you know. When the cherubs raised Bontshe on high and sounded a heavenly fanfare, when Father Abraham reached out to shake his hand like an old friend, when Bontshe heard that a gold crown and a chair awaited him in paradise, and that the heavenly prosecutor had no case to present, he behaved exactly as he would have in this world. That is, he was too frightened to speak. His heart skipped a beat. He was sure it must be either a dream or a mistake. He was accustomed to both. More than once in this world of ours, he had dreamed of finding gold in the street, whole treasure chests of it, only to awake as great a beggar as before. More than once, some passerby had smiled or said hello, only to turn aside in disgust upon realizing his error. That's how my luck is, Bontshe thought. He was afraid that if he opened his eyes, the dream would vanish, and he would find himself in a dark cave full of vermin. He was afraid that if he uttered a sound or moved a limb, he would be recognized at once and whisked away by the devil. He was trembling so hard that he did not hear the cherubs sing his praises or see them dance around him. He did not return Father Abraham's hearty greeting or bid the heavenly tribunal good day when he was ushered before it. He was scared out of his wits. His fright, moreover, grew even greater when his eyes fell involuntarily on the floor of the courtroom. It was solid alabaster, inlaid with diamonds. Just look where I'm standing, he thought, too paralyzed to move. Who knows what rich Jew or rabbi they mixed me up with? In a minute he'll arrive, and that will be the end of me. He was too frightened to hear the presiding judge call out, "The case of Bontshe Schweig," adding as he handed Bontshe's file to the defense counsel, "You have the floor, but be quick." The whole courtroom seemed to revolve around him. There was a buzzing in his ears. Gradually, he began to make out the counsel's voice, as sweet as a violin. "The name of Bontshe Schweig, Bontshe the Silent," the counsel was saying, "fit him like a tailored suit." "What is he talking about?" wondered Bontshe, just as the judge remarked impatiently, "No poetry, please." Not once in his whole life, the counsel for the defense went on, did he complain to God or to man. Not once did he feel a drop of anger or cast an accusing glance at heaven. Bontshe still understood nothing. Again the brusque voice interrupted, "You can skip the rhetoric too." Even Job broke down in the end, whereas this man, who suffered even more, "Stick to the facts," warned the bench. At the age of 8 days, his circumcision was botched by a bungler. That doesn't mean the gory details. Who couldn't even staunch the blood. "Proceed." He bore it all in silence, continued the counsel for the defense. Even when, at the age of 13, his mother died and her place was taken by a stepmother with a heart of a snake. "That does sound like me," marveled Bontshe. "No hearsay evidence," snapped the judge. She scrimped on his food. She fed him moldy bread and gristle, while she herself drank coffee with cream in it. "Get to the point." She didn't spare him her fingernails, though. His black and blue marks showed through the holes in the old rag she dressed him in. She made him chop wood for her on the coldest days of winter, standing barefoot in the yard. He was too young and weak to wield the axe, which was too dull to cut the wood, which was too thick to be cut. He wrenched his arms and froze his feet more times than you can count, but still he kept silent, even before his own father. "His father, a drunk," laughed the prosecutor, sending a chill down Bontshe's spine. "He never complained," continued the defense counsel. "He hadn't a soul to turn to. No friends, no schoolmates, no school. Not one whole item of clothing, not a free second of time." "The facts," repeated the bench. He even kept silent when his father, in a drunken fit, took him by the neck one snowy winter night and threw him out of the house. He picked himself out of the snow without a peep and followed his feet where they took him. At no time did he ever say a word. Even when half dead from hunger, he never begged, except with his eyes. At last, one dizzy, wet spring evening, he arrived in a great city. He vanished in it like a drop of water in the sea, though not before spending his first night in jail for vagrancy. And still he kept silent, never asking why or how long. He worked at the meanest jobs and said nothing. And don't think it was easy to find them. Drenched in his own sweat, doubled over beneath more than a man can carry, his stomach gnawed by hunger, he kept silent. Spattered with the mud of city streets, spat on by unknown strangers, driven from the sidewalk to stagger in the gutter with his load, beside carriages, wagons, and tramcars, looking death in the eye every minute, he kept silent. He never reckoned how many tons he had to carry for each ruble. He kept no track of how often he stumbled and fell. He didn't count the times he had to sweat blood to be paid. Never once did he stop to ask himself why fate was kinder to others. he kept silent. He never even raised his voice to demand his meager wage. Like a beggar, he stood in doorways, glancing up as humbly as a dog at its master. "Come back later," he would be told. And like a shadow, he was gone, coming back later to beg again for what was his. He said nothing when cheated, nothing when paid with bad money. He kept silent. "Why, perhaps they mean me after all," thought Bontshe, taking heart. "Once," continued the counsel for the defense after a sip of water, "things seemed about to look up. A droshky raced by Bontshe, pulled by runaway horses, its coachman thrown senseless on the cobblestones, his skull split wide open. The frightened horses foamed at the mouth, sparks shot from under their hooves. Their eyes glittered like torches on a dark night, and in his seat cringed a passenger, more dead than alive. And it was Bontshe who stopped the horses. The rescued passenger was a generous Jew who rewarded Bontshe for his deed. He handed him the dead driver's whip and made him a coachman, found him a wife and made him a wedding too, and was even thoughtful enough to provide him with a baby boy. And Bontshe kept silent. "It certainly sounds like me," thought Bontshe, almost convinced, though he still did not dare look up at the tribunal. He listened as the counsel went on. "He kept silent when his benefactor went bankrupt, without giving him a day's pay. He kept silent when his wife ran off and left him with a little infant. And 15 years later, when the boy was strong enough to throw his father into the street, Bontshe kept silent then, too." "It's me, all right," decided Bontshe happily. He even kept silent in the hospital, the one place where a man can scream. He kept silent when the doctor would not examine him without half a ruble in advance, when the orderly wanted 5 kopecks to change his dirty sheets. He kept silent as he lay dying. He kept silent when he died. Not one word against God. Not one word against man. The defense rests. Once again, Bontshe trembled all over. He knew that the defense was followed by the prosecution. Who could tell what the prosecutor might say? Bontshe himself hardly remembered his own life. Back on Earth, each minute had obliterated the one before. The counsel for the defense had reminded him of many forgotten things. What might he learn from the prosecution? "Gentlemen," the voice of the prosecutor was sharp and piercing. At once, however, it broke off. "Gentlemen," it resumed, although more softly, only to break off again. When it spoke a third time, it was almost tender. "Gentlemen," it said, "he kept silent. I will do the same." There was a hush. Then, from the bench, another voice spoke tenderly, tremulously too. "Bontshe, Bontshe, my child," it said in harp-like tones, "my own dearest Bontshe." Bontshe felt a lump in his throat. He wanted to open his eyes at last, but his tears had sealed them shut. Never had he known that tears could be so sweet. "My child, my Bontshe." Not once since the death of his mother had he been spoken to like that. "My child," continued the judge, "you have suffered all in silence. There is not an unbroken bone in your body, not a corner of your soul that has not bled, and you have kept silent. There in the world below, no one appreciated you. You yourself never knew that had you cried out but once, you could have brought down the walls of Jericho. You never knew what powers lay within you. There in the world of deceit, your silence went unrewarded. Here, in the world of truth, it will be given its full due." The heavenly tribunal can pass no judgment on you. It is not for us to determine your portion of paradise. Take what you want. It is yours, all yours. Bontshe looked up for the first time. His eyes were blinded by the rays of light that streamed at him from all over. Everything glittered, glistened, blazed with light. The walls, the benches, the angels, the judges. So many angels. He cast his dazed eyes down again. Truly, he asked, happy but abashed. Why, of course, the judge said. Of course. I tell you, it's all yours. All heaven belongs to you. Ask for anything you wish. You can choose what you like. Truly? Asked Bontshe again, a bit surer of himself. Truly, 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 clamored the heavenly host. Well then, smiled Bontshe, what I'd like most of all is a warm roll with fresh butter every morning. The judges and angels hung their heads in shame. The prosecutor laughed.
Okay, I want to first open up the discussion and just ask first general impressions, and if you want specifically too, also your impressions of Bontshe.
Emma, do you want to stop the screen share and then?
Let me do that 1 second.
Yeah. Great.
There we go. Okay.
So I will say that it was funny in that he was a complete blank slate, and the whole story was what other people projected upon him.
Emma, when was this story written, please?
So I have a little context to show later. I can do that earlier if you want, but it was written in 1894 and it was first published in a socialist magazine.
I can comment on the writing style. I was very impressed by all the descriptive adjectives at the beginning when they described Bontshe and his lifestyle, you can call it that. And also there was a certain rhythm to it. He had words in the same sentence that had the same pattern, like 2 syllables ending with er, matter and better. And I found it very almost musical, the writing style.
I saw it as a political commentary. People who, I didn't know whether it was condemning the Jews for passivity with pogroms and, just how persecuted they were. But essentially, Bontshe condemned himself. He didn't have the insight and he was like a nebbish. He couldn't speak up for himself. He couldn't have the vision. He couldn't have the bigger picture of what life could be.
I found it interesting that Father Abraham, the patriarch, was the one who met him, because on the one hand, Abraham stands for hospitality and warmth and chesed and hachnasat orachim, welcoming guests. But on the other hand, Abraham stood up to God and argued with God and questioned God, something that Bontshe didn't do. So he kind of was a split figure for me and why he was welcoming Bontshe.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that.
I didn't quite understand the prosecutor's response at the very end, why he started laughing. I mean, was it because Bontshe proved himself to be such a simple man that that's all he wanted was the roll and butter? Was there something malicious about his laughter?
Hmm.
I'm actually, if you don't mind, unless anyone has any other comments, I'm going to give a little historical context.
Mm.
And then I have some prompts that we can look at to think about the story. I'm going to go back. Okay. Can everyone see?
Yes.
Great. And hopefully there we go. Great. Okay. So as I was saying before, it was published in 1894 and it was published in a socialist magazine and it was in Yiddish. It was called Bontshe Schwag, which is, and just a little bit about Peretz too. He lived from 1852 to 1915. And he was, of course, this is without including the woman writers in Yiddish, but they were considered three, they literally called them the father figures of Yiddish modern literature, which is Mendel Macher's Sforim, Peretz, and then also Sholem Aleichem, who wrote the Tevye stories. And Peretz used a lot of folk and also folk stories and also religious text in his work and kind of would switch it on his sides. And he changed a lot in his political movements. He was a socialist first. He had a brief stunt in the Zionist movement, and then he became later on, he was a diaspora nationalist, which advocated more for living within the diaspora, within the world as a Jew, and making political and cultural room for the Jews to live that way. And he was also part of the Haskalah, which was the Jewish Enlightenment, which really promoted education and somewhat secular education too. And there's just at this time period when this story was written, all these different movements, whether the political, the Bundist, socialist, the Zionist, diaspora, nationalist, all these different movements were going on, as well as a lot of artistic and religious and academic movements. It was just a huge time in Eastern European Jewish life. And also, the story is so popular as I like Leonard Nimoy was the one that introduced it. He had the interpretation, which is a little closer to the socialist interpretation at the end. But the story, I wanted to just give context that over time and depending on when it was read, it how people viewed it really changed after the Holocaust. Depending on who you were, Bontshe was considered more of a martyr or a model of humility. And for the Zionists, he was considered more of a passive Jew who was living in the diaspora and not fighting. But also in America, during the blacklisting and the McCarthyism, he was also considered more of a martyr, and it was considered more in the context of Jewish identity rather than just class. So I just wanted to give that brief overview. Hopefully that made sense. I'm definitely ask questions of any of that if I went too fast. But I also wanted to look a little bit. I'm going to stop the screen share a moment. With that consideration, if that makes sense, I just wanted to open up the discussion. And in a modern context, what do you think about Bontshe or in the time periods? I don't know if anyone has anything they were thinking about. Sharon? Oh, Sharon, we can't hear you.
So in the beginning, I thought, well, it's really the story of Job. And I thought that's interesting. And how is it going to end? And then in the end, the simplicity of the man just, it reminds me of when you ask people today, they've been through such a hard year and you say, well, what do you really want? And they'll say, I just want to hug my child. I just want to roll in butter. And I thought that was a beautiful end. I can't really remember what happened to Job. I was trying to think about it. He was rewarded, and then I can't think. Maybe Rabbi can tell me. And then it's the other story of when bad things happen to good people. How do you respond to that, and how do you look at your possible reward in heaven or your reward here on earth? I thought it was a wonderful story to read.
Ibrahim?
Yes, it seems to me that this story, particularly being published in a socialist publication, was really a warning that staying silent or being accommodating doesn't get you anywhere.
Okay. Of, unless someone has something to say, I also prepared a good part for us to maybe to deep dive a little more. I found some, maybe Rabbi can help me or anyone else. I don't have much religious knowledge, but some pieces from the Tanakh or other just religious Jewish texts, since we're in a Jewish book club, to try to consider this through a Jewish lens. So, one, can you read that okay? And two, would anybody like to read this first excerpt?
For the sake of Zion, I will not be silent. For the sake of Jerusalem, I will not be still, till her victory emerge resplendent and her triumph like a flaming torch.
I have a little more. I think maybe we'll, if someone wants to read the other two excerpts.
I'll read number 5.
Okay, thanks.
Rabbi Akiva says, joking and lightheartedness acclimate towards promiscuity. Tradition is a safeguarding fence around Torah. Ties are a safeguarding fence around wealth. Vows are a safeguarding fence around abstinence. A safeguarding fence around wisdom is silence.
I'll just read this one quick. For you, silence is praise, God in Zion, and to you the vow is paid. And I know we're going through this quick, but we'll go back. And there's just two more, if anybody wants to read.
I'll read. Shimon, his son, says, all my days I grew up among the sages, and I did not find anything good for a body but silence. And the explosion of Torah is not what is essential, but the action. And whoever increases words brings sin.
Even a fool, if he keeps silent, is deemed wise. Intelligent, if he seals his lips.
No, yeah, that's it. So I can go back and forth, but I thought I gave a couple different perspectives on silence. And I can go back into the full screen so we can see everyone, unless you want to look at the text and I can go back and forth. But did any of them jump out on you, especially in the context of Bontshe?
And I think we have a tension in Judaism between watching your language and like skillful thinking and then like chutzpah. And like they're both deemed valuable in different contexts. So silence when it comes to observing your own mind and not being foolish and being careful with your speech and the ethics of speech in some contexts is so valued. But in other contexts, holy chutzpah and speaking out is like the most Jewish menschly way you can be. And it depends on context. And it doesn't seem like the context of Bontshe, it was such an admirable trait.
I would like to relate this, the questions that go back and forth here to the violence that's occurring as we speak between Israelis and Palestinians. There are claims, there's violence, there's wisdom to be searched for. What can we learn here? I mean, is being silent a good answer here? Or if we speak, the question is, what do we say? Do we contribute to heat, or do we shed some light?
Good question.
I was impressed with the idea of Bontshe being offered all of these treasures and diamonds and alabaster and wealth beyond compare. And when in fact he found his voice, all that he really wanted was something so mundane and so sustaining. And I think that that's another parable, Abraham, for what's going on in Israel. That in fact, what the two sides are warring on is not fabulous riches to oil or technology. What they're fighting for is something as mundane as freedom and respect. That's what I'm pulling out. I don't think that word mundane sounds pejorative, but you know what I'm saying, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to add something to that, which may not have a lot to do with the story, but I find that listening to various news reports about what's going on in Israel, I try to listen to as much as I can. And it's scary because each station, depending on its proclivity, is leaving out stuff. Like I didn't know until this morning that the Israelis had asked the Palestinians not to pray for a certain time because Netanyahu was giving a speech. I didn't know that because all that was reported that I heard yesterday was out of nowhere, the Israelis ran in and started shooting. And I find the news just by innuendo is so biased and so frightening in getting people to take sides, that I'm really scared. I mean, that is, to me, is the most frightening thing in the world. You can't get an honest news report. Well, I shouldn't say couldn't. The New York Times had something this morning that I thought was pretty decent. But still, I mean, it's really rare to feel that you've gotten the whole story. And I believe that the news people probably know the whole story, but they're not giving us the whole story. Sorry, I'm off topic a little bit.
No, it does have to do with how you use your voice. And I wanted to, Lily posted, I'm going to read what she wrote. In the context of modern times and our exploration of the ways we collectively and individually contribute to racism and oppression, I think this story really emphasizes the dangers of complacency or silence. It seems like silence is dependent on the circumstance, and maybe the piety or the spirituality lies somewhere in one's ability to discern the difference.
Emma, can I ask you a question?
Sure, I can see if I can answer.
Okay. Why did you select this story?
I went through so many stories, to be honest. It was so hard picking one.
Yeah.
And I wanted to do a older text. I had been exploring some more modern ones recently. And I also wanted something a little light, but also something that we could really grapple with, because I like Peretz. I like some other stories a little better, at least on a literary side. But I think this one has just a lot to dig into, or also just, I think it has so many interpretations, which is important in literature. So I thought, hopefully, it seems like everyone is answering, but I think that's really important. Yes, Abraham.
I'm grateful that you brought us Peretz. I mean, I just based on this, I want to read more. His personal story I found very moving, that he was, disbarred because of his speaking up, his activity. It's reminiscent of the story itself. Thank goodness he had such talent. You could see he understood the courtroom, the procedures, and the characters, and we're there alive in the courtroom. I mean, it is so vivid. I mean, I just love his languaging.
Yeah, I mean, he had an interesting life too, by the way, if you want to look into his biography. He had some interesting marital situations too, but but also I think it's important too, picking up on what you said, Abraham. Also, it's focused on Bontshe, but a lot of the key factors too are the judges and how they create judgment too, and what's important to them. I think that's just as crucial to the story as the idea of voice or passivity or whatever context we're looking at him at. Yes, Louise.
I think it's interesting that the prosecutor didn't speak, essentially. He was silent. And yet that silence was so powerful at the end. It had an impact. So I think that Peretz was showing us both sides of the equation, that, silence is valued and silence is condemning. He didn't make it simple.
It's funny in that most fairy tales start or end up with, if you could have 3 wishes, what would you want? Well, all the money in the world, the power to do everything I want, and ultimate control over everybody. But this guy just asked for a roll and butter.
I also have, in case of anyone, I don't have to. This is maybe me because I'm taking a Yiddish course at the moment. But since it was written in English, excuse me, Yiddish, I have the Yiddish, and then I have multiple translations of the end, because this is, I mean, it's a translated work, of course. It's depends on who writes it and what context. But I don't want to interrupt anyone if anyone else had any other thoughts.
I think it would be appropriate for all of us to go enjoy a roll in butter.
Well, I immediately wanted one when that was said, but I'm curious about other translations as to did they change the meaning at all of the prosecutor laughing?
One second. And I actually have it read in Yiddish too. Excuse me, this is still before. Okay, are you able to see this? I try to make it as large as I could.
Yes, I can see it.
So if anyone wants to maybe start with Moshe Spiegel's 1958 translation.
I'll do it. Really? Asked Bontshe by now in a firmer tone. Naturally, he was answered from all sides. Well, in that case, Bontshe announced with a smile, I would like to have a hot roll with butter for breakfast every day. The judges and angels were stunned. The heavenly informer burst into laughter.
I'm trying to think. I think the second's a little close to what we read. Does someone want to read Hilda Abel's 1954 translation? I could read it if not.
I can read it. It's all right. Really? Bontshe asks again, and now his voice is stronger, more assured. And the judge and all the heavenly host answered, really, really, really. Well then, and Bontshe smiles for the first time. Well then, what I would like, Your Excellency, is to have every morning for breakfast a hot roll with fresh butter. A silence falls upon the great hall, and it is more terrible than Bontshe's has ever been. And slowly the judge and the angels bend their heads in shame at this unending weakness they have created on earth. When the silence is shattered, the prosecutor laughs aloud, a bitter laugh. And I'm sorry, that's my dog and her toy.
Okay, thank you, Miriam. And I've seen different translations, and this second one, there's still the prosecutor laughing, and it is said bitterly, but sometimes there's different ways that the angels react. They're stunned in one, they're shattered in a different. The other translation, they're ashamed. And I mean, there's other interesting parts of the narrative, but I don't know. Did that strike any?
Well, it changes the story and the meaning. Like the prosecutor had a bitter laugh in the Abel translation, and he just laughed in the Frank, and then he burst into laughter in the other one. And then the way the angels react, it changes the whole meaning.
I'm also puzzled by the heavenly informer character. I mean, that's so different from a prosecutor. I mean, I don't even know what that means, a heavenly informer.
I don't know if anyone else knows, but I'm not sure myself.
Sounds like a contradiction in terms to me.
I took it as that he understood who Bontshe was, that he knew he could see into his soul or whatever, that he understood his character.
I mean, I think everyone really hit every single part. I mean, there's so many ways to look into this piece, I think. I mean, I'm always impressed. I don't need to do anything here. I have it in a teeny bit in Yiddish if you want to hear. If not, we can gossip. We can leave a little early if anyone has any final thoughts.
Although I know there's always a problem with translating stories and poetry, there are vast differences. It does surprise me that it could be that far afield in the different translations. I mean, you would think that the Yiddish words have a clear enough history that you can translate it, more exactingly. I don't know, just the feeling.
But as Emma said, if it changes according to context and the year that people were looking at the story, it makes sense that it would be translated differently.
And can I just ask if this same subject was treated in the movie that comes to mind with Peter Sellers, where he's a gardener and everybody thinks he's brilliant because he doesn't say anything? Chauncey Gardner? When in fact he just had nothing to say. I think it was called Being There.
I'm sorry, I don't know the movie, but it seemed like everyone else knew the reference. That's intriguing. I don't know if that has any shared context or.
And there was also a play we saw in Philly about 30 years ago at the Cherry Street Theater or the Walnut Street Theater called The Foreigner. And it was a similar theme where the main character, to avoid social interactions, pretends he doesn't speak the language, and everybody takes him into their confidence like a bartender and tells them their problems, and then he becomes imbued secondhand with the people think that he's brilliant and they treat him like the rabbi. So I guess this theme has been explored, although in the Yiddish version, as we were looking at the different word interpretations, it's a different focus on what is the meaning of his silence.
I find myself thinking that you have to look at Peretz's intention, being that it was published in a socialist publication, probably reveals a lot.
And this is a really famous story, and it has been reinterpreted. It's, I think it was made into a play. I forget exactly, but I mean, even in Abraham led this in Gimple the Fool, the short story. Basivus Singer took inspiration from this short story by Peretz. It does have a long history in the, especially Yiddish or Ashkenazi, but in Jewish literary and artistic life.
Could you read it in Yiddish for us?
Yeah, should we end out on with some Yiddish? Okay, let's hope this opens for me. Okay. By the way, I used, this is from the Yiddish Book Center. They have fabulous, they have a book club. They have different ways you can look at books and teacher's guides. So I did steal a little bit from them. Okay, I think this should be the translation. I mean, Yiddish.
Danke, spricht Bontsche noch einmal, nur schon mit der sicheren Kohl. Danke, 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 antwortet man ihm auf sicher von allen Seiten. Oi, was soll ich, schmeichelt Bontsche, will ich danke, alle Tage in der Früh, a heiße Wolke mit frischen Putten. Da Jungen und Malochen und mir aufgelost die Käpfe verschämt. Der Kategel hat sich zu lacht.
That was just a little ending part that we looked in different translations.
It carries all of the emotion, even if you don't understand a word.
And it has the puter, butter. Broch and puter. Oh, well, thank you everyone for joining. I always have a fabulous time listening to everyone's.
Emma, we are blessed to have you
Yes.
bring to us. We thank you so much.
Thank you. This was wonderful, as usual. Bye.
Thank you,
Have
Emma.
a great
Thanks, Emma.
afternoon. Bye.